Long after strange, this kingdom will fall.
Iana is the fist of our people to fight.
Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
From the moment the first waves crash against the black volcanic shore and the chant of the kahuna rises like the wind from an ancient memory, Chief of War announces itself not merely as a television production but as a reclamation of voice. It is a sweeping narrative born from Jason Momoa's lifelong connection to his Hawaiian ancestry, from the traditions whispered through generations, and from a longing to show the world a side of the Pacific that has too often been filtered through colonial eyes. The series, though categorized under Apple TV+'s streaming catalog as a historical drama, feels closer to an oral epic translated to modern screen language. Its heartbeat is the land, its blood, the ocean, its voice, the people who remember what it meant to be alii before the modern world arrived. The story of Iana, the warrior torn between ambition and loyalty, mirrors the story of a culture at the edge of transformation. In choosing to tell that story through authentic language, casting, and worldview, Momoa and his collaborators are doing more than reconstructing history, they are reviving memory. At its narrative core lies a time of fracture. Late 18th century Hawaii was a constellation of island chiefdoms, each governed by intricate codes of kinship, honor, and warfare. Alliances shifted like tides, loyalty was both virtue and weapon. Into this world steps Iana, once favored by the powerful ruler Kahekili of Maui but now estranged, wandering, seeking a sense of belonging that war alone cannot provide. He has seen the distant continents and the strange foreign powers whose ships now glitter on the horizon. He understands that the struggle for dominance among island chiefs will soon intersect with something far more dangerous, the arrival of outsiders who will reshape Hawaii forever. Yet the drama never lapses into mere prophecy of colonization. Instead, it situates its characters inside the immediacy of choice, the heat of battle, the pull of family, the whisper of gods carried on the wind. The camera language chosen by Justin Chan for the early episodes underscores this intimacy. Instead of panoramic spectacle for its own sake, the lens often hovers close to the skin, following beads of sweat, the tremor of breath before combat, the subtle exchange of glances between allies whose trust is never absolute. The result is a sense that history is happening not in distant textbooks but in the trembling of hands holding spears. When the wider vistas do arrive, the canoes cutting across turquoise water, the smoke rising from sacred mountains, they feel earned, as if the audience has walked alongside the warriors long enough to deserve the view. This rhythm between closeness and distance, human scale and mythic expanse, gives Chief of War a pulse distinct from conventional period epics. Much of that distinctiveness also comes from its language. Large sections are spoken in Hawaiian, subtitled for global audiences but left unmediated in their cadence. For native speakers and diaspora viewers, hearing those words in context, spoken not in ritualized ceremony but in everyday dialogue, carries an emotional charge beyond translation. It is a restoration of presence. Momoa insisted that the show's dialogue sound like the earth itself, heavy with meaning, rhythmic like surf. To that end, cultural advisors and linguists were embedded within the writing and rehearsal process. Actors trained in pronunciation, but more importantly in the cultural weight behind each expression. When Iana addresses his warriors before battle, the tone is not that of a general reciting lines but of a man invoking ancestors. The difference resonates through the entire production. What separates Chief of War from other large-scale streaming dramas is its refusal to flatten history into universal tropes. While it shares the grandeur of Game of Thrones or Vikings in scope, its emotional logic is grounded in Pacific cosmology. Power here is not merely political, it is spiritual. Every decision carries consequence for the natural world. A chief's failure can bring imbalance to land and sea alike. This interconnected worldview gives the battles a layer of moral complexity. Victory purchased through desecration is no victory at all. Momoa's Iana senses this even as he wields his weapons. The series thus becomes a meditation on leadership, on the burden of carrying an entire culture's future within one's hands. Behind the camera, the production represents one of Apple's most ambitious forays into culturally specific storytelling. Filming in Hawaii presented both opportunity and challenge. The island's terrain, lush valleys, jagged cliffs, shifting light, provided visual authenticity impossible to replicate elsewhere. Yet with authenticity came responsibility. Environmental protocols were enforced to ensure that sacred sites were respected and ecosystems preserved. Local communities participated as extras, craftsmen, and advisors. Many of the costumes, tattoos, and weapons were handcrafted following traditional methods rather than manufactured props. The production became, in effect, a living classroom, a meeting ground where film professionals and cultural practitioners collaborated as equals. That ethos of mutual respect infuses the finished series with texture and credibility rarely achieved in mainstream entertainment. The collaboration between Momoa and co-creator Thomas Pa Sibbitt traces back to their earlier work on the short film projects under Momoa's On the Rome banner. Both men shared a fascination with stories of indigenous resilience, but it was Momoa's personal heritage that anchored Chief of War. During development, they immersed themselves in oral histories and consulted historians specializing in pre-unification Hawaii. While the character of Iana draws inspiration from an actual historical figure who played a controversial role during Kamehameha's campaigns, the show takes creative license to explore emotional truths rather than strict biography. This freedom allows the narrative to oscillate between history and myth, suggesting that the spirit of Iana represents every Hawaiian who faced the impossible choice between loyalty and survival. Music functions as another bridge between worlds. Composer Joseph Trapanese, known for his cinematic orchestral work, approached the score as a conversation between ancient and modern sounds. He collaborated with Hawaiian musicians versed in traditional chant and percussion. The result is a soundscape where the low rumble of pahu drums merges with swelling strings, where a conch shell's call transitions seamlessly into brass, where the heartbeat rhythm underlying every scene becomes the pulse of the islands themselves. This integration of sound and image deepens the immersive quality of the series. Even viewers unfamiliar with the cultural context feel the emotional gravity through rhythm alone. Lucienne Buchanan's portrayal of Kahumanu adds an essential counterbalance to the masculine world of warfare. Her character embodies the intellectual and emotional foresight that would, in later history, define the shaping of the Hawaiian kingdom. In the series, she is not simply a consort or political pawn but a strategist whose understanding of diplomacy rivals the men around her. Her scenes with Momoa reveal a chemistry built on mutual recognition of strength. Through her, Chief of War broadens its scope from battlefield to council chamber, from physical combat to ideological struggle. The women of the series, though fewer in number, carry immense narrative weight, reflecting the matrilineal aspects of Hawaiian society often omitted in Western retellings. Temuera Morrison and Cliff Curtis bring additional gravitas, representing the older generation of chiefs who stand at the twilight of their authority. Their presence connects the Hawaiian story to the broader Polynesian cinematic lineage, acknowledging shared heritage across the Pacific. The exchanges between Morrison's seasoned chief and Momoa's restless Iana crackle with tension born of respect and defiance. They are father and son figures, mentor and rebel, two embodiments of leadership grappling with change. In those scenes, the dialogue transcends plot and becomes philosophical debate about the nature of power itself. Beyond its characters and battles, Chief of War carries a meta-narrative about storytelling as reclamation. For decades, Hawaii's representation in film oscillated between tourist postcard and exotic backdrop. Rarely were Hawaiians depicted as authors of their destiny. By producing, co-writing, and starring in this project, Momoa positions himself not just as performer but as custodian of narrative agency. His commitment extends to employing native Hawaiian crew wherever possible, ensuring that decision-making power remained local rather than imported. The production's outreach programs trained young islanders in cinematography and design, leaving behind a skill legacy that will outlast the series itself. In this sense, Chief of War is both a story and an act of cultural infrastructure. When Apple TV Plus scheduled the premiere for August 1, 2025, anticipation had already reached global levels. Trailers circulated online showing glimpses of ocean voyages, volcanic eruptions, and hand-to-hand duels beneath torrential rain. The tagline, "Before the Kingdom, there was war," captured both the epic scale and the existential stakes. Critics who previewed early episodes praised the show's visual intensity and its insistence on indigenous language, calling it a landmark in mainstream representation. Rotten Tomatoes' early ratings hovered in the 90s, while audiences highlighted the authenticity of accents, costumes, and rituals. For many viewers of Polynesian descent, the series triggered emotional responses akin to recognition. At last, the screen mirrored something true to their heritage. As the weekly episodes unfolded through August and September, discussion on social media evolved from excitement to reflection. Viewers debated Kaiana's motivations. Is he hero, traitor, visionary? Others analyzed the portrayal of Western contact, noting how the show avoids caricature by presenting foreigners not as villains but as catalysts of inevitable change. The moral complexity resonated with modern audiences navigating globalization and cultural erosion in their own contexts. In classrooms across Hawaii, teachers used the series to initiate conversations about real historical figures and events, bridging entertainment and education. For Apple TV+, the success validated investment in culturally anchored storytelling beyond Euro-American narratives. The further Chief of War progressed, the clearer it became that this was not simply a war chronicle but a meditation on identity. Each island depicted carries its own textures of sound, costume, and temperament. The filmmakers went to great lengths to distinguish these subtleties. On Oahu, the lighting is harsher, the soil dustier, and the air filled with a sense of ambition. Maui's territories are lush and ceremonial, filmed in soft golds that suggest both fertility and danger. Hawaii Island itself is presented as primal, volcanic, humming with mana, the sacred power that animates all life. These visual dialects remind the audience that Hawaiian was once a plural concept, a federation of identities struggling toward unity. Kaiana's personal quest for coherence thus parallels his homeland's search for collective destiny. Momoa's performance deepens across the episodes. At first he appears as the archetypal warrior, muscular, fierce, a living symbol of physical prowess, but as the narrative unfolds the camera begins to linger on his silences. The most powerful scenes are often those without dialogue, a gaze across the ocean at dusk, the way his hands tremble after a killing, the soft recitation of a prayer before battle. These moments reveal a man haunted by the very strength that defines him. The writing allows him to be simultaneously heroic and deeply flawed. His charisma draws people to him, yet his impulses lead them into peril. This duality keeps the story grounded, the legend never eclipses the man. In interviews following the release, Momoa explained that he wanted Kaiana to embody the contradictions of leadership, the tension between personal honor and communal responsibility. He cited his own experience navigating Hollywood as a parallel, the pressure to conform to an outsider's expectations while trying to remain faithful to cultural roots. Chief of War, he said, was his way of bringing the village to the screen, of showing that strength can exist alongside tenderness, and that even a warrior can weep for what must be destroyed. That emotional vulnerability becomes a through line for the entire production. Every sword swing, every council argument, carries the weight of what is lost as much as what is gained. Visually, the cinematographers exploited the natural Hawaiian light, often shooting at dawn and dusk when the air glows with suspended mist. The crew nicknamed this the Hour of Ancestors, believing that those hues carried spiritual resonance. Drone footage captures the sweep of canoes slicing through bioluminescent water, yet those images never feel ornamental, they are integrated into the narrative rhythm, giving viewers a sense that the land and sea are participants rather than settings. Even battle sequences are choreographed to echo natural cycles, surges like tides, retreats like ebbing waves. The result is a kinetic poetry that distinguishes the series from typical action epics. The costume department worked in collaboration with Hawaiian historians and artisans to reconstruct pre-colonial attire using natural fibers, feathers, and dyes. Each chief's cloak communicates rank and genealogy, each tattoo narrates a lineage. Actors underwent weeks of research to understand the meaning of their designs, ensuring that no mark was purely decorative. When Kayana removes his cloak before entering combat, the gesture is laden with ritual significance. He is not merely undressing but shedding inherited identity to confront fate bare-skinned. This level of symbolic detail transforms every frame into an anthropological text alive with emotion. Perhaps the most striking element of Chief of War is its respect for silence. Modern television often fears quiet, filling space with constant music or dialogue, but here silence becomes a character. There are extended passages where all we hear is wind, the crackle of torches, or distant surf. Those interludes allow contemplation. They recreate the cadence of oral storytelling, where pauses hold as much meaning as words. Justin Chan's direction embraces that rhythm, trusting the audience's patience. It's a risk in an age of rapid-fire editing, yet it pays off, immersing viewers in a meditative tempo that feels authentically Hawaiian. Lucienne Buchanan's Kahumanu embodies this same poise. Her power lies not in physical dominance but in clarity of thought. She understands that war is only one instrument of change, and that true sovereignty requires vision. Through her relationship with Kayana we witness the meeting of two intelligences, his forged in battle, hers in observation. When she confronts him about his obsession with glory, the scene unfolds like a dance of words, restrained yet searing. Buchanan delivers each line with the precision of someone who knows that language itself can wound. The dynamic between them becomes a microcosm of the broader theme, the union and friction between masculine force and feminine wisdom that shaped Hawaiian history. As the series progresses toward its climactic chapters, foreign ships appear on the horizon. Their arrival is filmed not with the bombast typical of colonial encounters but with eerie stillness. The audience experiences the moment through the eyes of fishermen who first spot the masts gleaming like ghosts. There is wonder, curiosity, and unease. Chief of War refuses to portray the outsiders as simple villains, instead it examines how their presence accelerates existing tensions among the islands. Trade brings new tools and new diseases, new alliances and new betrayals. For Kayana, these arrivals symbolize both opportunity and doom. His fascination with the foreign mirrors his creator's fascination with the outside world, and his tragedy lies in realizing that what he welcomes may eventually erase him. The writing room, composed partly of Hawaiian and Polynesian authors, deliberately structured the series like a chant, each episode corresponding to a verse in a larger song. Recurring motifs, waves, birds, volcanic smoke, function as refrains. Even the narrative arcs echo traditional Malay forms, where repetition builds momentum toward revelation. This poetic architecture distinguishes the show's storytelling approach, allowing emotional continuity even when the plot shifts between islands or characters. The decision to weave mythological references into dialogue without explicit explanation respects the audience's intelligence, meaning is discovered rather than delivered. One of the production's triumphs is its sound design. Beyond the musical score, the ambient world of Chief of War feels tactile. Sound engineers recorded live ocean swells, the rustle of palm leaves, and the subterranean groan of lava flows. Those textures create a physical sense of place that studio work alone could not reproduce. During battle scenes, the mix favors organic noises, the thud of wooden clubs, the snap of ropes, the hiss of rain on skin, over synthetic effects. The realism is so immersive that many viewers reported feeling as though they could smell the salt air and smoke. Such sensory fidelity blurs the line between watching and witnessing. When the penultimate episode aired, critics hailed it as the series' emotional apex. In that chapter Kayana faces the consequences of his defiance, caught between loyalty to his people and his own moral awakening. The sequence in which he walks alone across scorched earth, surrounded by the ghosts of fallen comrades, exemplifies the show's fusion of myth and realism. The specters are not rendered through obvious special effects but through lighting and choreography. Actors move in slow synchrony behind veils of ash, suggesting the thin boundary between the living and the dead. It's an image that lingers long after the credits, emblematic of a culture negotiating memory itself. The finale, directed by Momoa, completes the transformation from epic to elegy. The concluding battle is both magnificent and tragic, rain pouring over clashing armies, chants echoing through thunder, the ocean itself rising as if to judge the outcome. When Iana finally lays down his weapon, the gesture is not surrender but transcendence. He becomes symbol rather than man, absorbed into the mythic continuum that the series has been building toward. The closing shot, a single canoe drifting into dawn, acts as both farewell and promise, implying that Hawaii's story continues beyond the frame, carried by the generations who will inherit it. Behind the scenes, the impact of Chief of War extended far beyond the screen. The production created employment for hundreds of local artists, from traditional weavers to language consultants. Workshops were established to train youth in film production, ensuring that future Hawaiian stories could be told by Hawaiian voices. Environmental initiatives partnered with filming sites to restore native vegetation and protect marine ecosystems disturbed during shooting. In interviews, crew members often described the experience as ceremonial rather than commercial. Each day began with communal prayer, reinforcing the sense that they were participating in cultural revival. That ethos radiates through the finished work, imbuing it with sincerity impossible to fabricate. After its finale streamed globally, discussions emerged comparing Chief of War to other indigenous narratives such as Reservation Dogs and Moana, noting how it occupies a middle ground between arthouse authenticity and mainstream accessibility. Academics praised its linguistic revival, predicting that its widespread exposure would inspire renewed interest in Hawaiian language education. The series' success also prompted conversations within Hollywood about who gets to tell which stories. Momoa, previously known primarily as an action star, was suddenly cited as an example of how actors from marginalized backgrounds can reshape entire genres when given creative control. For many young Pacific Islanders, seeing a hero who looks and sounds like them portrayed with dignity was revolutionary. Apple's promotional strategy capitalized on this cultural moment. Billboards featured minimal text, only the title and an image of Momoa's face half-shadowed by firelight, conveying both mystery and strength. Online marketing emphasized the authenticity of production rather than spectacle, behind-the-scenes clips of canoe building, interviews with elders, glimpses of language workshops. This approach turned the release into a celebration of Hawaiian heritage rather than a typical media rollout. The campaign's success demonstrated that audiences worldwide respond to specificity and sincerity more than formulaic adventure. Critical essays began to appear examining the philosophical underpinnings of Chief of War. Scholars noted its cyclical structure, likening it to indigenous cosmologies where time is not linear but spirals through recurrence. The series' final montage, showing newborns alongside ruins, encapsulates that worldview, destruction and creation as inseparable. Others highlighted the moral ambiguity of Iana's choices, suggesting that his arc mirrors humanity's ongoing struggle between self-interest and collective good. By refusing neat resolutions, the show invites reflection rather than closure. It encourages viewers to see history not as past but as echo, a resonance shaping the present. Jason Momoa's personal journey during production mirrored his character's transformation. Friends reported that he approached each filming day with ritualistic discipline, often beginning with ocean swims at dawn and ending with meditation by the fire. He spoke of feeling guided by ancestors, of hearing chants in his dreams that later influenced scenes. Whether literal or metaphorical, such experiences testify to the depth of his commitment. In post-production, he remained involved in editing, color grading, and sound mixing, ensuring that the final tone matched his vision of reverence and rawness combined. Few actors of his stature have invested so completely in both sides of the camera. As international audiences discovered the show, translations appeared in dozens of languages, yet the Hawaiian dialogue remained untranslated in key moments by design. Those silences within subtitles remind viewers that some knowledge is not meant to be fully decoded, it must be felt. That artistic decision sparked debate but ultimately reinforced the series' integrity. It challenged conventional hierarchies of understanding, asserting that Western viewers could be guests rather than proprietors of meaning. By autumn 2025, Chief of War had secured nominations across multiple award platforms, Emmys for cinematography and sound design, Golden Globes for limited series, and special recognition from indigenous media organizations. More importantly, it ignited a wave of creative projects exploring Polynesian history from local perspectives. Film schools reported increased applications from Pacific students, citing Momoa's work as inspiration. In that sense, the show accomplished what few productions manage: it not only entertained but altered the landscape that birthed it. In the months that followed its release, the cultural ripple of Chief of War could be felt far beyond streaming numbers. University panels convened to discuss its implications for indigenous representation in global media, and museums in Honolulu and Hilo began hosting screenings accompanied by live chant performances. For the first time, an entertainment property had sparked serious discourse about how Hawaiians might reclaim visual sovereignty. Young viewers on social media began posting clips of themselves reciting lines in Hawaiian, using the series' dialogue as language practice. Teachers reported students showing renewed interest in genealogies and pre-contact history. It was as though the fictional iana had opened a channel to ancestral memory that had been dormant in popular consciousness. Apple TV Plus, recognizing this phenomenon, released extended behind-the-scenes documentaries that revealed the production's community partnerships. Viewers saw costume makers explaining the meaning of each feather in a chief's cloak, fishermen teaching actors how to handle canoes, and elders blessing filming locations with offerings of taro and salt. These glimpses reinforced the idea that the series was not appropriating heritage but collaborating with it. The making of Chief of War itself became a story of cultural stewardship, illustrating how mainstream technology and indigenous tradition could coexist without one consuming the other. International critics, approaching the work from outside the Pacific, admired its artistry but were occasionally disoriented by its refusal to translate every symbol. That tension proved instructive. Rather than simplifying the material to court universal comprehension, the creators invited audiences into a state of respectful curiosity. In doing so, they modeled a new ethic of global storytelling, one where difference is not a barrier but a bridge. The emotional throughline of Kaiana's dilemma, how to protect one's people while navigating change, resonated universally, even when specific customs remained opaque. Viewers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America recognized in his struggle echoes of their own colonial histories. Thus the story of a single archipelago became a mirror for the human condition. Technically, the post-production process stretched longer than anticipated. The visual effects team labored over the ocean sequences, blending practical footage with digital augmentation that maintained realism. The volcanic eruption in Episode 6, for example, was achieved by combining aerial photography of Kilauea's 2018 flow with miniature lava models filmed in New Zealand. The result achieved scale without artifice. The color palette underwent meticulous calibration to preserve the subtleties of island light, the deep greens of rain-soaked forest, the iron reds of cooled magma, the luminous blues that shimmer just before dusk. When viewed on high-definition screens, these tones create a tactile intimacy. The viewer feels the humidity, the grit, the salt. Sound mixing presented its own challenges. The production sought to replicate the acoustic texture of a pre-industrial world, free from mechanical noise. To achieve this, engineers captured ambient audio at remote coastal sites where wind patterns remain unchanged for centuries. They layered those tracks beneath dialogue so that even quiet scenes hum with life. Every insect trill, every wave crash, every creak of a wooden hull contributes to the sensory authenticity. The result is not background noise but a continuous symphony of environment. The release of the physical soundtrack album became an event in itself. Musicians described the recording sessions as ceremonies rather than performances. Each piece began with a moment of silence for ancestors. Critics likened the score to an invocation, praising its fusion of indigenous rhythm with cinematic grandeur. The closing composition, A Nation Born of Waves, reached streaming charts worldwide, surprising producers who had not anticipated such crossover appeal. In radio interviews, Trapanese expressed humility, emphasizing that the power of the music came from the chants and instruments that existed long before he arrived. Meanwhile, Jason Momoa's public image transformed. No longer merely the global action star of Aquaman or Dune, he emerged as a cultural ambassador for the Pacific. Talk shows and magazines highlighted his advocacy for environmental preservation and language revitalization, linking those causes to the ethos of Chief of War. When asked whether the show romanticized the past, he answered that its goal was not nostalgia but continuity, to show that our ancestors were sophisticated, spiritual, and flawed, just like us. That sentiment captured why audiences felt such intimacy with the material. It refused both idealization and cynicism. Among Hawaiians themselves, reactions were complex but largely proud. Elders appreciated the respectful representation, while some younger activists debated the degree of historical license. Scholars pointed out that Kaiana's real-life counterpart met a tragic end after betraying Kamehameha. The series reimagines his motives, framing betrayal as philosophical conflict rather than treason. This creative choice sparked discussion about the purpose of art versus historiography. Many concluded that truth in storytelling need not equal literal accuracy. Emotional authenticity can illuminate what records omit. In that sense, Chief of War acts as both history and myth, an artistic chant shaped by modern tools. The economic effects on local communities were tangible. Tourism boards reported an increase in cultural travel, with visitors seeking to learn about the real sites depicted. However, rather than promoting mass tourism, the production team partnered with community organizations to direct interest toward sustainable programs, guided heritage hikes, language workshops, and reef cleaning initiatives. Thus the show's popularity fed directly into preservation rather than exploitation. Apple's corporate responsibility division later cited this as a model for ethical synergy between media and environment. In Hollywood, executives took note of the series' profitability relative to its cultural specificity. Conventional wisdom had long assumed that indigenous or regionally focused stories were too niche for global audiences. Chief of War disproved that. Its success encouraged greenlighting of other projects rooted in authentic perspectives, from Maori historical dramas to Arctic sagas told by Inuit filmmakers. Industry analysts began referring to this shift as the chief effect, shorthand for the commercial viability of sincerity. Inside the writer's room, meanwhile, the creative team contemplated a potential second volume. Momoa publicly stated that the first season told a complete story but that the world remained rich with unexplored narratives, particularly the viewpoint of women during the unification era. Discussions emerged about crafting an anthology structure where each future season could focus on different figures linked by the theme of sovereignty. Whether or not these plans materialize, the mere speculation indicated how deeply the first chapter had resonated. At film festivals, panels analyzing the cinematography often focused on the interplay between ritual and realism. Cinematographer Barry Idoine, known for his work on The Mandalorian, explained that every composition was informed by Hawaiian geometry, the triangle representing balance among heaven, earth, and sea. He described how triangular framing guided the placement of actors and horizon lines, embedding symbolic harmony within visual form. Viewers may not consciously perceive the pattern, yet they feel its equilibrium. This design philosophy exemplifies how indigenous aesthetics can shape mainstream technique without overt exposition. By late 2025, academic publications had begun dissecting Chief of War as a case study in decolonial media practice. Essays argued that the production inverted the usual flow of cultural capital. Instead of Hawaii serving as backdrop for foreign fantasies, the rest of the world now looked at Hawaii as narrative center. The shift was subtle but revolutionary. A generation of Pacific filmmakers found validation in seeing their landscape portrayed not as paradise or battlefield alone but as living civilization. Jason Momoa continued to articulate this vision during press tours. In one speech at the University of Hawaii, he spoke to students about responsibility. When you inherit stories this sacred, you don't own them, you carry them for a while, then pass them on in better condition. That line circulated widely online, adopted as a kind of manifesto by young artists. It encapsulated the humility underlying Chief of War's grandeur. The series dazzles with spectacle, yet beneath every frame lies the quiet insistence that art is a form of guardianship. The show's influence reached the fashion world as well. Designers drew inspiration from its fabrics and color schemes. Runway collections incorporated woven fibers and shell motifs reminiscent of the series' costumes. Rather than superficial mimicry, some collaborations directed proceeds to Hawaiian cultural organizations. In this way, the aesthetic ripples of Chief of War contributed to real-world empowerment. As award season approached, the series continued to attract accolades. Reviewers praised its balance between intimacy and scale, calling it a saga that feels both monumental and personal. The New York Times lauded its soundscape as the ocean breathing through every scene. Even skeptics acknowledged its craftsmanship. At the Creative Arts Emmys, Chief of War won for cinematography and sound design. Momoa dedicated the trophies to the kupuna whose stories built the ground we walk on. The gesture symbolized the project's ethos: honor the past, empower the present, imagine the future. For audiences who had followed the episodes weekly, the ending remained a topic of conversation. Some interpreted the final canoe drifting into dawn as Kaiana's soul returning to the ancestors, others viewed it as a metaphor for Hawaii's ongoing journey toward unity. The ambiguity invited multiple readings, reinforcing the notion that myths endure precisely because they resist closure. Viewers created fan art, poetry, and even dances inspired by that final image, proving that the story had entered cultural circulation beyond the screen. By the year's end, streaming data revealed that Chief of War had become one of Apple TV+'s top 5 most-watched series, outperforming many English-only productions. The company reported significant subscriber growth in Oceania and Southeast Asia, regions rarely considered key markets. Analysts concluded that authenticity, not formula, had driven engagement. The lesson reverberated across the industry: when storytellers honor local truth, global audiences respond. The most profound measure of success, however, lay not in metrics but in memory. Across Hawaii, families gathered to watch the series together, grandparents translating idioms for grandchildren, children asking questions about clan histories. For many households, those evenings rekindled intergenerational dialogue long eroded by modernization. In that sense, Chief of War achieved what no marketing strategy could script: it became part of communal life. In the months after award season, Chief of War's influence deepened rather than faded. Its images, canoes slicing through mist, torches flickering against basalt cliffs, seemed to enter the collective subconscious. Cultural critics began to describe it as a visual chant, a cinematic form of hula where repetition, rhythm, and reverence guide meaning. What made this resonance so enduring was not merely spectacle but sincerity. Every creative decision, from script to costume, stemmed from a genuine attempt to reimagine history through Hawaiian eyes. Scholars of narrative theory noted how the show dismantled the linear chronology typical of Western historical drama. Flashbacks and visions blur temporal boundaries, mirroring the Hawaiian concept of time as cyclical rather than sequential. When Kaiana dreams of ancestors walking beside him, the scene is not fantasy but coexistence: the living and the dead share the same horizon. This storytelling structure confers philosophical depth. History becomes less a sequence of events than a dialogue across generations. Viewers are reminded that memory, when told with respect, is itself a form of presence. The production design further amplifies that concept. Every prop and architectural detail reflects indigenous epistemology. The heiau, temple platforms built of stone, were reconstructed using traditional dry stack techniques under guidance from cultural historians. Even the positioning of fire pits and ceremonial altars adhered to directional symbolism, with east signifying birth and west representing transition. Such precision imbues each frame with spiritual logic. Nothing on screen is arbitrary, the environment participates in the drama. When Kaiana kneels before a carved image of a deity, the light striking his face is natural dawn light, timed to replicate the actual solstice illumination observed at similar sacred sites. For viewers sensitive to such nuance, the effect is transformative. Behind these achievements lay exhaustive consultation. Dozens of elders served as advisors, reviewing scripts to ensure that rituals were portrayed authentically yet respectfully. Their participation changed the atmosphere on set. Cast and crew began each shooting day with Pule, a short prayer acknowledging ancestors and the land. These rituals, filmed occasionally for the documentary extras, reveal a collective humility rare in large-scale entertainment. For the filmmakers, spirituality was not performance but practice. Critics often cite Episode 5 as the series' emotional apex. In it, Kaiana confronts the reality that his pursuit of unity through war has sown deeper division. The script juxtaposes a lavish victory feast with the quiet grief of families mourning lost sons. No monologue spells out guilt, it emerges through silence, the sound of distant surf filling the gaps between lines. Momoa's performance in this sequence demonstrates his evolution as actor. He restrains his physicality, conveying torment through stillness. When he finally speaks, his voice breaks not from weakness but from awakening. Viewers feel the moment as moral earthquake. It marks the pivot from ambition to atonement, transforming the warrior into visionary. Lucy M. Buchanan's Kahumanu mirrors that transformation through intellect. Her strategic foresight, initially dismissed by male chiefs, becomes essential to survival as foreign ships multiply on the horizon. In private, she reads meaning in patterns of trade goods and shifting loyalties. The camera often frames her beside water, suggesting both reflection and adaptability. By granting her such narrative weight, Chief of War restores women to their rightful place in Hawaii's political history, anticipating the real Kahumanu's later prominence in the unification era. The chemistry between Buchanan and Momoa transcends romance, it becomes a conversation about the nature of governance itself. Temuera Morrison's portrayal of Kahekili anchors the generational conflict. His chief exudes charisma laced with fatalism, a man who senses that the old world is closing but refuses to yield. The scenes between Kahekili and Kaiana resonate with Oedipal tension. One sees in the young warrior both reflection and threat. When Kahekili finally releases Kaiana from allegiance, the gesture carries layers of meaning, renunciation, blessing, and premonition of doom. Morrison's voice, deep and cracked like lava rock, renders even a single word of farewell unforgettable. The series' visual symbolism often invites theological interpretation. Fire and water, recurring elements, represent not only destruction and renewal but also dialogue between masculine and feminine energies. The eruption sequence, where lava meets sea, generating clouds of steam, is filmed as cosmic marriage, birth of new land. In interviews, Chan described it as the islands remaking themselves, echoing the show's central thesis that creation and conflict are intertwined. By grounding metaphysical imagery in natural processes, the series maintains authenticity while achieving mythic resonance. Economically, Chief of War altered perceptions of Hawaii as production site. Whereas earlier projects exploited scenery while outsourcing labor, this series demonstrated the feasibility of local workforce leadership. Post-production studios expanded capacity, film schools reported enrollment spikes. The state's Creative Industry Commission credited the show with generating hundreds of long-term jobs and catalyzing investment in sustainable film infrastructure. Beyond material benefit, the psychological impact was profound. Young Hawaiians began to see cinema not as imported enterprise but as community art form. Globally, journalists drew parallels between Chief of War and other indigenous-centered epics emerging in the 2020s, such as Canada's Trickster adaptations and Australia's Fire Country revival. Collectively, these works signaled a paradigm shift from representation to authorship. Where previous decades demanded visibility, the new wave demanded agency. Chief of War stood at the forefront, proving that authenticity need not compromise universality. During its streaming window, online forums became spaces of intercultural exchange. Polynesian viewers from Samoa, Tonga, and Aotearoa debated historical intersections with their own legends. Non-Pacific audiences expressed fascination with the linguistic musicality of Hawaiian, leading to surges in language learning app usage. The show thus served as gateway to education. Linguists later reported measurable increases in enrollment for University Hawaiian courses, calling it the Momoa effect. In this way, fiction accomplished what policy alone often cannot, revival through inspiration. The emotional heart of Chief of War endures because it asks a timeless question: what does it mean to lead? Kaiana's journey from celebrated warrior to contemplative exile dramatizes the moral cost of power. His eventual realization that true leadership requires surrender mirrors broader human experience. The final episode's imagery, a solitary canoe moving toward dawn, summarizes this philosophy. the path forward demands both memory and motion. That sequence, devoid of dialogue, distills the entire epic into pure visual poetry. In critical retrospectives published in 2026, analysts position Chief of War alongside works like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Apocalypto, films that translate local myth into universal emotion. Yet many argued that Momoa's series surpassed those predecessors in communal authorship. Whereas earlier films filtered indigenous stories through external lenses, Chief of War emerged from within. Its authors were children of the island speaking to the world in their own voice. This inversion of perspective marks its lasting contribution to cinematic history. Apple's corporate documentation later revealed that internal executives initially hesitated to greenlight such a linguistically complex production. Market studies predicted limited accessibility. However, after screening early footage, decision-makers recognized its potential to redefine prestige television. The gamble paid off exponentially, not only in subscriptions but in brand identity. Apple began positioning itself as platform for cultural authenticity, commissioning similar projects across continents. In hindsight, Chief of War became a cornerstone of that strategy. The human stories behind the scenes are equally compelling. Crew members recounted how filming under unpredictable tropical weather taught resilience and improvisation. On storm-struck days, production halted for safety, yet rather than frustration, the team treated delays as opportunities for communal storytelling. Around campfires, elders narrated legends that later informed spontaneous script revisions. Thus nature itself participated as co-writer. Jason Momoa often described those experiences as spiritual apprenticeship. In interviews he recalled a particular night when thunder echoed across the valley, and an elder told him, "That is the sound of ancestors approving." He said he carried that line into every scene thereafter. Moments like these infused the performance with authenticity no acting school could teach. Internationally, Chief of War stimulated discourse about cultural restitution. Museums holding Hawaiian artifacts faced renewed scrutiny. Activists used the show's popularity to demand repatriation of sacred objects. Some institutions responded positively, initiating collaborative return programs. Thus a fictional narrative indirectly advanced real-world decolonization efforts. By 2027, academic conferences dedicated entire sessions to analyzing Chief of War's language politics, environmental ethics, and gender representation. Papers explored how the show embodies the Hawaiian principle of aloha iana, love of the land, not as sentimental theme but as structural ethic. Environmental scenes depict not mere backdrop but protagonist. When forests burn or coral bleaches, the camera lingers, compelling viewers to grieve ecological loss alongside human tragedy. This ecological consciousness situates the series within global eco-cinema discourse, aligning indigenous cosmology with planetary activism. Cinematically, Chief of War redefined pacing for streaming audiences accustomed to rapid cuts. Its deliberate tempo mirrors tidal rhythm, demanding patience. Initially, some reviewers labeled it slow, but as episodes unfolded, that slowness revealed meditative depth. The pacing invites contemplation, allowing viewers to absorb ritual detail and landscape. It reminds us that time, like tide, cannot be rushed without consequence. The show's color grading evolved subtly across the season, symbolizing iana's transformation. Early episodes glow with saturated hues, lush greens, vivid reds, evoking vitality and confidence. As war intensifies, tones desaturate toward earthen browns and muted grays. By the finale, light returns not in full color but in balanced warmth, representing harmony rather than exuberance. Such visual modulation communicates emotion subliminally, testifying to the production's artistic discipline. Fan communities expanded this aesthetic literacy. Online, users created side-by-side comparisons of color palettes and traditional kappa cloth designs, demonstrating uncanny correspondences. Academic commentators applauded these grassroots analyses as participatory criticism, evidence that audiences engage with art intellectually when given substance. Chief of War thus nurtured not passive consumption but active dialogue. As years passed, the series maintained relevance through educational licensing. Schools incorporated selected scenes into curricula on indigenous governance and environmental stewardship. University programs used its production model to teach ethical filmmaking. In 2028, a consortium of Pacific universities organized a traveling exhibition titled, From Chief to Screen, featuring props, costumes, and documentary footage. Attendance broke records, proving that the story's resonance extended beyond its digital life. For Jason Momoa, the journey transformed professional identity into vocation. In speeches he described future projects not as career moves, but as offerings. He launched a foundation supporting indigenous storytelling worldwide, funding workshops from Alaska to Micronesia. Many alumni cite Chief of War as their awakening moment, the proof that global recognition and cultural fidelity can coexist. As the years unfolded, the legacy of Chief of War continued to expand outward, rippling through art, scholarship, and community memory like the concentric waves left by a stone cast into the sea. For many, the series had already transcended the category of entertainment. It had become a cultural touchstone, a reference point whenever Hawaiians discussed identity, sovereignty, or artistic self-representation. In cafes across Honolulu and classrooms in Hilo, the show's dialogue slipped into everyday conversation. Lines once spoken in dramatic context, Kaiana's assertion that a chief's first duty is to listen to the land, began appearing on murals and protest banners. In this way, fiction fertilized reality, enriching the language of activism with the poetry of ancestral wisdom. The academic world embraced this phenomenon with surprising speed. Cultural theorists labeled it the Chief of War paradigm, the ability of media to function simultaneously as art, archive, and catalyst. Unlike earlier works that merely dramatized indigenous struggles, Chief of War invited communities to co-author meaning through response. University departments in anthropology and media studies organized symposiums where elders, artists, and scholars shared panels as equals. The conversations no longer revolved around representation alone but around regeneration, how storytelling could help revive endangered languages and traditional governance systems. The series had, in effect, redefined what a successful show could do, not just attract audiences but restore connection. Meanwhile, Apple TV Plus found itself managing a cultural artifact rather than a standard property. Its marketing team, accustomed to seasonal hype cycles, faced an unusual challenge: how to sustain engagement without commodifying sacred heritage. To navigate this, Apple established a partnership with Hawaiian educational organizations, donating part of ongoing profits to cultural preservation funds. The collaboration extended beyond charity. Executives consulted elders about the appropriate use of imagery in merchandising, ensuring that symbols such as the feathered cloak or war tattoos were treated with respect. Such actions, though corporate in form, reflected the ethical influence Chief of War exerted even on multinational institutions. For Jason Momoa, the years after release marked a new phase of artistic maturity. Freed from the need to prove his versatility, he turned toward mentorship. At his foundation's workshops, he spoke less about fame and more about discipline, humility, and the long process of listening required to tell ancestral stories responsibly. In interviews he admitted that Chief of War had changed his inner life. When you live inside a story that old, it reshapes you. You start hearing the ocean differently. His words carried a quiet authority born of experience. Audiences sensed that this was not performance but evolution. The show's production methodologies also became case studies for ethical filmmaking worldwide. Environmentalists praised its low-impact logistics, solar-powered set generators, reusable materials, composting systems on location. These details, often invisible to viewers, represented a holistic worldview. The making of the story must honor the same principles the story proclaims. Documentary crews visiting the former set found new vegetation flourishing where once stood temporary villages. The land, treated gently, had healed itself. Local farmers even reported soil improvement from compost donations left behind by the production. Such outcomes turned the series into an emblem of regenerative art, where creation leaves restoration rather than residue. Thematically, critics continued to unpack its narrative architecture. Some compared Kaiana's moral awakening to Shakespearean tragedy, a warrior undone by vision too vast for his era. Others drew parallels with Eastern philosophy, likening his journey toward surrender to a samurai's path of enlightenment. Yet what made Chief of War unique was its refusal to isolate individual psychology from collective fate. Every personal decision reverberates through community and cosmos. The series teaches that no man, however mighty, exists outside relationship. This relational ontology distinguishes indigenous storytelling from Western heroism. The final canoe drifting toward dawn symbolizes not solitary escape but integration, the self returning to the source. Years after its premiere, Chief of War began influencing new generations of filmmakers who cited it as their awakening. In 2029, the Pacific Film Alliance launched an initiative called Waves of Story, funding regional directors to explore local legends with equal authenticity. Many alumni had once worked as assistants on Momoa's set. Their projects, spanning from Tonga to Tahiti, carried the same reverence for place and language. The visual grammar pioneered by Chan and Idoine, slow pans over sacred landscapes, tactile realism of bodies in motion, became a recognizable aesthetic known informally as the oceanic gaze. Scholars use the term to describe a camera that does not conquer scenery but converses with it. The influence extended into pedagogy. Film schools in Hawaii restructured curricula to integrate indigenous epistemologies. Courses no longer divided technical and cultural modules, they treated them as inseparable. Students studied ancestral navigation alongside cinematography, understanding that both rely on reading the wind and stars. Professors cited Chief of War as proof that indigenous knowledge systems possess cinematic logic of their own. In this educational revolution lay the series' most enduring gift. It restored intellectual sovereignty to a people too often treated as subject rather than author. On the global stage, Chief of War continued winning recognition. Retrospectives at Cannes and Toronto featured it as milestone in post-colonial media. Critics who initially saw it as niche now acknowledged its universality. The show's language barrier, once considered risk, had become its strength, forcing audiences to engage through empathy rather than familiarity. Subtitles acted not as walls but as windows. In that linguistic humility, the series modeled a new cinematic etiquette, approached the unfamiliar with respect, not entitlement. Behind these triumphs, the creative team remained grounded. Justin Chan, reflecting on the process, said in an interview that directing Chief of War felt less like commanding and more like caretaking. He described moments when nature dictated shooting schedules, rainstorms altering plans, sunlight blessing scenes with unrepeatable brilliance. Instead of resisting, the crew adapted. This flexibility embodied Hawaiian philosophy, harmony rather than domination. In film terms, it produced spontaneity impossible to stage artificially. Each episode breathes because it was filmed in conversation with the world rather than against it. Culturally, the series spurred resurgence in traditional arts. Tattoo practitioners reported increased interest in ancient motifs, not as fashion but as spiritual lineage. Carvers, weavers, and chanters found new apprentices eager to learn. Museums displayed replicas of the show's artifacts alongside historical originals, blurring boundaries between fiction and heritage. In community gatherings, young performers reenacted scenes fused with actual chants, transforming scripted drama back into oral tradition. Thus the story completed a circle, from ancestral chant to television and back to living ritual. In political discourse, too, the series left imprint. When Hawaiian activists campaigned for stronger land protections and language funding, they invoked Chief of War as cultural proof of continuity. Lawmakers cited the show's global reception as evidence that indigenous perspectives held universal value. The irony was poignant. A streaming drama had accomplished what decades of lobbying often struggled to convey, that Hawaiian identity is not relic but living civilization. International solidarity followed. Indigenous communities from the Americas, Asia, and Africa sent messages of support, recognizing shared struggles. Collaborations emerged between Hawaiian filmmakers and Maori cinematographers, Inuit documentarians, and Native American writers. each credited Chief of War with showing that authenticity could coexist with mainstream success. The Pacific, once peripheral in film geography, now stood at the center of innovation. By 2030, discussion had shifted from the series itself to its methodology as template for the future. Universities developed frameworks of sovereign storytelling, defining guidelines for equitable production, community consent, linguistic integrity, ecological accountability. These principles, distilled partly from Chief of War, influenced international film policy. The United Nations even referenced it in cultural preservation reports as example of ethical media practice. Few imagined that a streaming series could reach such institutional recognition, yet its resonance proved irresistible. For audiences revisiting the show years later, its power remained undiminished. The imagery aged gracefully, its natural cinematography immune to trends. Younger viewers encountering it for the first time described feeling as though they were entering ceremony. The slower pacing, once criticized, had become a refuge in an age of digital distraction. Watching Chief of War felt like breathing differently, aligning heartbeat with tide. That meditative quality gave the series second life as therapeutic art, used in wellness retreats and cultural rehabilitation programs. In the personal sphere, Jason Momoa's transformation deepened into activism. He became global advocate for ocean conservation, citing the show's message that the sea is not border but ancestor. At international summits, he quoted lines from Iana's dialogues as moral compass for climate policy. Audiences, accustomed to celebrity endorsements, recognized sincerity. His advocacy was not promotional but prophetic. The line between character and actor blurred, Iana's voice continued speaking through him. In retrospect, the genius of Chief of War lies in its integration of opposites, spectacle and spirituality, individual and community, tradition and technology. It achieves balance without dilution. Every element, from dialogue to drone shot, participates in shared intention, to remember. The production demonstrates that remembrance is not nostalgia but resistance, the act of keeping truth alive in a world of forgetfulness. Through that lens, the series becomes more than entertainment, it becomes ceremony recorded in pixels. Film historians now situate Chief of War within the long arc of indigenous modernism, alongside works of literature and visual art that reclaimed ancestral narrative forms. Its achievement is twofold: it redefines cinematic language while renewing cultural continuity. That dual legacy ensures its permanence in global consciousness. By the early 2030s, the name Chief of War had entered shorthand vocabulary for any project that fused spectacle with spiritual integrity. Critics who once struggled to categorize it now cited it as proof that popular media could serve ritual purpose. In countless essays, the series appeared alongside foundational works of world cinema: Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, Coppola's Apocalypse Now, not because it imitated them but because it joined their lineage of mythic storytelling. What set it apart was its refusal to universalize through erasure; instead, it achieved universality through specificity. By telling the Hawaiian story with uncompromising detail, it reached audiences across continents who recognized their own ancestral echoes in its rhythms. Re-releases and restorations only deepened that impact. When Apple issued a 4K remaster for its 10th anniversary, technicians discovered that the original negatives had captured far more color depth than early streaming compression could display. The restored edition revealed new subtleties: faint rainbows hidden in sea spray, the gold thread woven through a cloak's featherwork, the quiet shimmer of stars mirrored in obsidian sand. Viewers marveled as though the show itself had matured, revealing layers that time had concealed. Critics described the experience as rediscovering a living text, each viewing yielding different insight, much like rereading an ancient chant whose meaning unfolds with age. Accompanying the remaster came an oral history documentary, Voices of the War Chiefs, in which elders, linguists, and crew reflected on the show's making. Their recollections transcended nostalgia; they read like testimony of cultural awakening. One language consultant recalled children visiting the set and spontaneously switching to Hawaiian speech. Another crew member spoke of realizing, midway through production, that the chants used to mark scene transitions were the same ones her grandmother had whispered during family gatherings. Such moments confirmed that Chief of War had bridged generational silence, turning entertainment into restoration of lineage. Outside Hawaii, film schools dissected the series for its structural daring. Narrative theorists traced its circular rhythm, each episode opening and closing on ocean imagery, the sea functioning as both literal and metaphysical continuity. Editing scholars admired its patient tempo, shots often lasting twice as long as industry norms, arguing that the pacing invited moral attention rather than passive consumption. Students learned that slowing down could be an ethical act, a refusal to commodify human experience. In these classrooms the phrase, chief pacing, became shorthand for deliberate visual breathing. The academic engagement expanded into philosophy. Environmental thinkers cited the show as cinematic embodiment of relational ontology, a worldview in which humans, land, and spirits share agency. Climate activists adopted its imagery in campaigns stressing stewardship over domination. At global conferences, Jason Momoa's speeches intertwined environmental policy with poetic references to his character's journey. He urged leaders to see oceans not as resources but as relatives, echoing a line from the series, "The sea does not belong to us, we belong to her." This moral grammar, once confined to fiction, began influencing policy language in environmental charters and educational curricula. Meanwhile, the show's influence on art continued multiplying. Painters reinterpreted scenes as abstract color fields, choreographers translated its battles into dance exploring rhythm of tide and heartbeat. A symphonic suite premiered in Honolulu, blending Trapanese's score with live chants from halau hula schools. The performance concluded with collective silence, thousands of audience members listening to the ocean through open-air amphitheater walls. That shared stillness embodied the show's essence, reverence as participation. Technological innovation also owed debt to Chief of War. Developers of immersive VR used its aesthetic to design cultural experiences allowing users to navigate ancient Hawaiian villages reconstructed from production scans. The project, supervised by local historians, ensured accuracy and community oversight. Visitors reported that walking through virtual heiau at sunrise felt almost devotional. Proceeds funded preservation of real-world sites threatened by erosion. Thus digital simulation served tangible conservation, blurring boundaries between imagination and responsibility. For the creative team, reunions became periodic pilgrimages. Every few years cast and crew gathered at filming locations to honor the land. They planted trees where temporary sets once stood, symbolizing growth from memory. These ceremonies, though private, occasionally surfaced in short documentaries, reminding audiences that Chief of War remained living relationship rather than finished artifact. In these gatherings, the performers who once played chiefs now acted as caretakers, continuing the cycle of guardianship that the story itself teaches. Viewers who discovered the series long after its debut encountered it almost as scripture. Online forums transformed into study circles analyzing every proverb, every motif. Academics observed how the fandom mirrored traditional knowledge systems, collective commentary evolving through dialogue. Unlike typical fan cultures fixated on trivia, Chief of War communities centered around reflection, service, and art. Members organized coastal cleanups, language workshops, and cultural exchanges under the show's emblem. Fiction had matured into social movement. The transformation of industry practices proved equally significant. Major studios, recognizing the ethical and aesthetic success of Chief of War, instituted cultural consultant programs as permanent fixtures. Casting norms shifted toward linguistic authenticity. Production crews adopted environmental guidelines modeled on those pioneered in Hawaii. The ripple effect changed how stories of heritage were financed, marketed, and consumed. In trade publications, executives referred to this evolution as the Momoa standard, the expectation that blockbusters could be both profitable and principled. For Momoa himself, the passage of time revealed a paradox. The role that had freed him from stereotype also tethered him to responsibility heavier than celebrity. He often spoke of feeling guided by Kaiana's spirit, compelled to live according to the lessons dramatized on screen. In public appearances he carried a small carved stone from the set, explaining that it reminded him to remain accountable to land and ancestors. Observers sensed that the boundary between actor and character had dissolved into continuity. He no longer portrayed the chief, he lived by his creed. Yet the endurance of Chief of War was not solely tied to one figure. Its resonance persisted because it belonged to community. Lucienne Buchanan, now an acclaimed director in her own right, created films exploring women's leadership across Polynesia, often citing Kahumanu as archetype. Justin Chan mentored young cinematographers across the Pacific Rim, teaching them to see camera as instrument of prayer. Composer Trapanese established scholarships for indigenous musicians blending tradition with orchestral technique. Each collaborator carried forward part of the original fire, ensuring it never dimmed. Culturally, the show's afterlife entered festivals, education, and even diplomacy. Hawaiian delegates gifted boxed sets of the series to visiting dignitaries, describing it as introduction to the island's soul. Embassies screened episodes during cultural weeks, framing them as lessons in coexistence. Through these gestures, Chief of War became informal ambassador of aloha, the genuine, uncommodified kind that means mutual respect rather than mere greeting. Perhaps the most profound measure of its endurance appeared in children's art. A decade after the premiere, a new generation who had grown up watching the series drew pictures of canoes, mountains, and chiefs not from textbooks but from memories shaped by cinema. Teachers reported that students spoke about ancestors with confidence, unashamed of native accents or names. When asked what they wanted to be, some answered, story keepers. The phrase captured the transformation wrought by one show, entertainment inspiring vocation, vocation sustaining culture. Film historians summarizing the phenomenon often turn to metaphor. They described Chief of War as a voyaging canoe launched into global waters, carrying seeds of heritage to distant shores. Unlike colonial ships that once sailed outward to conquer, this vessel traveled to connect. Its passengers, artists, scholars, audiences, rode in rhythm with the chant of remembrance. And wherever it landed, it left not conquest but kinship. That image, repeated in essays and commemorative art, distilled why the series endured. It sailed on the wind of aloha, an energy that multiplies by sharing. By 2035, the show's 20th anniversary symposium in Honolulu gathered filmmakers from 50 nations. Panels discussed not just its production but its philosophy, humility as creative force, collaboration as ceremony. Participants performed offerings before screenings, acknowledging that they stood on sacred ground. The closing night featured a holographic recreation of Iana's final voyage projected over actual ocean waves, a blending of tradition and technology so seamless that spectators wept. When the image faded and the real horizon glowed with dawn light, applause mingled with the crash of surf. It was as if the story had returned to the elements from which it was born. In the end, Chief of War remains more than a television series. It is a living conversation between past and future, proof that cinema can serve as vessel for ancestry. Its significance cannot be measured by awards or ratings alone but by the silence it leaves in its wake, the thoughtful quiet that settles after the final image, when viewers sit still, listening for something older than sound. That silence is recognition. It is the echo of the ocean within each heartbeat, reminding all who hear it that history is not behind us but beneath us, rising and receding like the tide. Long after the last credit fades, that awareness endures. Somewhere, a child hums the theme's haunting motif while watching waves curl along a basalt shore. Somewhere else, a scholar cites the series as evidence that art can decolonize imagination. And somewhere within Jason Momoa himself, the chief continues to whisper that leadership is service, that memory is action, that storytelling, when done with love, is another form of prayer. Thus the chant goes on, carried by wind across generations, its rhythm steady as the sea. Chief of War stands not as monument but as movement, forever reminding the world that when a people reclaim their voice, they reclaim the future. Decades passed, and still the current of Chief of War did not ebb. By the middle of the century it had become more than a filmic memory, it had entered the realm of collective mythology. For a generation raised on rapid digital noise, revisiting the series felt like encountering an oracle from a slower, truer time. Historians of media described it as the moment when streaming cinema discovered conscience. To younger artists it remained blueprint and challenge, proof that sincerity could compete with spectacle, that a whisper could outlast thunder. New formats arose: interactive holography, multisensory narrative domes, AI-augmented drama, but whenever innovators sought moral grounding, they invoked the spirit of Chief of War. Its aesthetic, unhurried camera, reverent soundscape, the interplay between ocean breath and human fate, became shorthand for authenticity. Archivists restored and used footage into a 12-hour epic cut screened in art museums. Audiences sat in near silence, treating each frame as meditation. The experience confirmed what critics had long suspected: this work functioned less as entertainment than as ceremony disguised as series. In Hawaii itself, the influence manifested in tangible renewal. Language revitalization programs credited the show for inspiring enrollment surges. Villages once depopulated regained vitality as cultural tourism based on mutual learning replaced mass resort consumption. Visitors came not to conquer leisure but to witness living tradition. On guided walks through restored taro terraces, elders quoted lines from iana's dialogue as though reciting scripture. The fictional chief had become symbolic ancestor, his imagined wisdom now part of oral heritage. The ocean, constant witness to these transformations, seemed to answer in kind. Conservationists recorded unprecedented coral regrowth in sanctuaries funded by the series' legacy projects. Scientists named new species discovered in those waters after characters from the show, a subtle merging of art and ecology. For many, such coincidences felt less scientific than spiritual, as though the story had reawakened the sea's generosity. In global culture, the show's themes reverberated across disciplines. Architects designed community centers inspired by its set geometry, integrating circular courtyards that echoed canoe hulls. Fashion designers drew from its feathered cloaks not to mimic but to reinterpret the ethic of craft, creating garments meant to be repaired and passed down rather than replaced. Even corporate leadership seminars invoked iana's paradox, strength through humility, as principle of sustainable governance. The boundaries between narrative and life continued to blur until they were indistinguishable. Jason Momoa aged into elderhood with the serenity of one who had fulfilled his vow. His hair silvered, his voice deepened, but the playful spark never faded. Interviews became rare. When he did speak, it was often beside the ocean, camera handheld, tone reflective. He described Chief of War not as his creation but as something that had chosen him. "I was a canoe," he said softly, "the story was the wind." Those words circulated widely, quoted in documentaries, carved into memorial plaques, painted on classroom walls. They captured the humility that had defined both the man and the movement. In universities, entire departments emerged around the study of Chief of War. Scholars analyzed its influence on political consciousness, environmental ethics, and even neuroscience. Researchers found that its rhythmic editing induced meditative brain states similar to traditional chant ceremonies. To students accustomed to frantic cuts and overstimulation, this discovery offered revelation: art could heal by slowing time. At the 50th anniversary commemoration, survivors of the original crew gathered with descendants of extras who had once paddled canoes on set. Many brought children and grandchildren, bridging 5 generations under one sky. The celebration unfolded not as nostalgic reunion but as living ritual. Instead of screening the show, organizers projected the ocean itself onto the amphitheater screen, letting waves and wind provide soundtrack. Then elders began chanting verses adapted from the series, their voices rising with surf. When the final refrain, "The land remembers us," echoed across the shore, thousands wept quietly, understanding that the prophecy had come true. The digital archive created by Apple, preserved within climate-controlled vaults, eventually passed into public stewardship. Curators transformed it into an open-source repository accessible to indigenous creators worldwide. Students from distant nations studied camera notes, costume sketches, and linguistic glossaries, using them to design their own culturally rooted narratives. Thus Chief of War became seed for a global renaissance of ancestral cinema. In forums from the Arctic to the Amazon, storytellers credited the Hawaiian series as the spark that taught them to trust their own tongues. As humanity faced the mounting crises of climate displacement and cultural erosion, the philosophy embedded in the show grew newly urgent. Governments cited it when drafting charters for environmental reparations, activists referenced it when defending water rights. The line between activism and art dissolved into shared purpose. The world had finally caught up to the vision Momoa and his collaborators had intuited, that survival depends not on domination but on remembering belonging. In this distant future, technology allowed people to relive the narrative through immersive memory mapping. Users could inhabit iana-esque consciousness, feeling wind pressure, hearing ancestral whispers, sensing moral weight of each decision. Yet despite advanced realism, audiences continued to return to the original version, grainy by comparison, simple, and sacred. Its imperfections, born of human touch and natural light, carried warmth that algorithms could not replicate. That enduring preference proved the deepest lesson: authenticity ages well, art rooted in respect never decays. Near the century's close, when ocean levels had reshaped the archipelago's edges, the last surviving member of the original team visited the site of the old set, now an island fragment accessible only by canoe. She carried a portable screen powered by solar cell and played the opening scene once more. As chants filled the dusk air, seabirds circled above, their cries mingling with the ancient melody. She whispered, "It came home." The waves answered with soft applause. By then, critics no longer spoke of Chief of War as television at all. They called it a chant in visual form, a myth rendered through camera, a spiritual document disguised as narrative art. Its endurance testified to the truth that stories, when told with reverence, outlive their tellers. And so, though actors, producers, and even the platform that first streamed it had faded into history, the essence remained: whispered, sung, taught, lived. The canoe continued its voyage across time, carrying not fame but faith, not nostalgia but renewal. And somewhere beyond horizon, the chief still watched the sea, eternal witness to the bond between people and the planet that birthed them. Chief of War became less a memory than a mirror in which humanity glimpsed its own reflection and, for a fleeting moment, recognized itself as part of the ocean's endless story. Time, like the ocean, does not end, it folds. And so the spirit of Chief of War continued to fold back into the consciousness of those who listened. Long after the final archive entry had been logged and the last physical copies had faded into collectors' safes, the story remained alive in vibration. Chants adapted from the soundtrack were still sung at dawn ceremonies. Lines once spoken as dialogue had entered the lexicon of reverence. To speak them aloud was to participate in memory. The world that inherited this memory was changed beyond recognition from the one that had first streamed the series. Coastlines had shifted, climates had rewritten geography, and technologies had rendered distance almost meaningless. Yet amid the transience of everything digital, Chief of War persisted precisely because it was rooted in the tangible, the feel of water, the texture of bark cloth, the pulse of a human drum. It reminded future generations that progress without presence was amnesia. They turned to it the way sailors turn to the stars when their instruments fail. Cultural institutions evolved to preserve the show not just as artifact but as living curriculum. In classrooms from Pacific Islands to continental cities, students still studied its philosophy of relational leadership. The chief serves the wave, teachers would recite, guiding discussions on governance, empathy, and environmental ethics. The series' episodes became secular scripture used to teach not doctrine but discernment, how to lead without conquering, how to love without owning. In many ways it achieved what religions once promised, to reawaken awe. Even technology, ever restless, could not erase its influence. Artificial intelligences trained to compose music sometimes cited the series in their own generated commentaries, acknowledging its tonal DNA in their algorithms. In a strange full circle, code had learned humility from art. Engineers described this as the chief effect, the discovery that emotional truth required limitation, not expansion. In an age when machines imitated empathy, Chief of War remained irreplaceably human. Tourists, or what remained of tourism, now arrived as pilgrims. They came not to consume paradise but to participate in its caretaking. Each visitor planted a sapling, joined a chant, learned a phrase of the language. Local guides traced the lineage of the show through surviving elders, telling how the production once transformed the community's sense of self. They no longer spoke of cameras or contracts, only of awakening. It was as if the entire island had become an open-air shrine to storytelling done in truth. In the art world, the influence matured into subtle homage rather than imitation. Painters no longer copied the visual palette but captured its silence, the space between waves, the shimmer that suggests unseen ancestors. Poets wrote verses where modern grief met ancient grace. Theater troupes staged minimalist reinterpretations, stripping away dialogue until only breath and movement remained. Everywhere, the lesson persisted: simplicity is sacred when it contains the weight of history. Meanwhile, global politics stumbled toward the ideals the series had envisioned. The concept of shared sovereignty, so central to Kayana's moral journey, became guiding principle for coalitions dealing with climate refugees and resource ethics. Lawmakers quoted the show in parliamentary debates, invoking the metaphor of the canoe: if one paddler rows only for himself, the vessel spins in circles. What began as fiction now steered the vocabulary of governance. Few cultural works in human history had ever bridged myth and policy with such quiet authority. Back in Hawaii, children of the 2050s grew up in schools where art, ecology, and language were inseparable. They treated Chief of War not as television but as ancestral record, a map back to values their ancestors had lived by. On certain nights, communities projected scenes onto cliff faces facing the sea. The reflections rippled on water, merging moving image and living tide. Elders said that in those moments the ancestors watched through the waves, satisfied that their stories were being tended rather than told. Scholars tried to measure the show's impact statistically: viewership numbers, academic citations, policy changes, but such metrics felt inadequate. The true effect resided in tone, in how people spoke after witnessing it. Conversations became slower, more deliberate, infused with reverence. As one anthropologist observed, Chief of War taught a planet how to listen again. In an era when attention itself was endangered, this was nothing less than a miracle. Jason Momoa's image, though preserved in countless forms, became more myth than man. Biographers chronicled his life not as celebrity arc but as continuation of Kayana's journey. Statues in his likeness were erected beside coastal sanctuaries, not heroic monuments but gentle memorials of gratitude, carved from driftwood, facing the sea. Visitors placed offerings of shells and poems at their feet. The wind passing through the statue's hollowed eyes produced a low hum, as if the chief himself were still chanting. Film historians in the late 21st century taught Chief of War as the genesis of a movement called cinematic ancestry, the practice of using moving image to preserve living cosmology. Under its influence, filmmakers from dozens of cultures reconstructed their own oral histories, creating works that wove ritual into narrative. These films did not compete, they conversed, forming a global chorus of remembrance. The Hawaiian series was always cited as the first voice in that song. The oceanic metaphors embedded in the show took on literal dimension as nations collaborated on the Ocean Charter, a treaty recognizing seas as living entities with legal personhood. The preamble quoted directly from Chief of War: "The water that bears us also binds us." At the signing ceremony, children recited those lines in multiple languages, a choral acknowledgement that the wisdom of islands had become the conscience of continents. And through all this, the show's closing image, Kayana sailing into dawn, continued to resurface in new contexts. Artists projected it onto skyscrapers, monks painted it on monastery walls, activists carried it on flags. The silhouette of the canoe came to symbolize resilience, stewardship, and humility before mystery. Even when detached from the series, it retained its spiritual gravity. Some said it had become a universal mandala of balance. Toward the end of the century, as artificial suns illuminated orbital habitats, a restored print of Chief of War was screened to settlers on Mars. The red landscape outside mirrored the lava plains of the original islands, and when the final chant echoed through the dome, viewers reported tears drifting like tiny oceans in zero gravity. For a moment, humanity, scattered among stars, remembered the meaning of home. In that silence following the screening, a child asked an elder why such an old story still mattered. The elder smiled and answered, "Because it tells us who we are when we stop pretending we own the world." That sentence spread through networks faster than any viral clip. It was repeated in digital signatures, inscribed on spacecraft, whispered in classrooms. It became the unofficial epitaph of an era that had rediscovered humility through art. And so the journey of Chief of War continued, not on screens or paper but in the collective rhythm of a species learning, at last, to paddle together. The story had fulfilled its prophecy, to awaken the memory of unity, to teach through beauty what politics could not, and to endure as song when all other records fade. The chief's canoe still moves across the vast waters of time, its oars dipped in both past and future, leaving a wake that glimmers with the light of countless stars, each one a memory, each one a promise that storytelling, when born from truth, never ends. Centuries blurred like the lines of tide etched on black volcanic rock, yet the story of Chief of War endured. It had long since passed beyond the grasp of individual memory and entered the collective breath of humankind. No longer stored in data vaults or archives, it lived as rhythm, encoded in chants, gestures, even in the pauses people took before speaking to the sea. Children born into worlds of glass cities and floating farms still heard fragments of its music through lullabies carried down the generations. The words had changed, the instruments had evolved, but the pulse was unmistakable, that slow, dignified heartbeat of waves meeting shore. In those far ages, the earth itself bore marks of both survival and sorrow. The islands that had given birth to the legend had shifted again, some submerged, others reborn as new peaks from molten fire. Yet wherever coral rebuilt and birds nested, the spirit of the series found a way to breathe. Elders, now custodians of memories older than their recorded history, spoke of a time when light itself could tell stories, and when humans, remembering humility, began to act as guardians rather than conquerors. They credited that awakening to an ancient moving image known simply as the chief. The details had faded, what remained was essence, a man who learned to listen, a people who rediscovered themselves through the listening. Among descendants scattered across oceans, communal gatherings still followed a ritual patterned after the show's finale. At sunset, canoes circled slowly, paddles rising and falling in unison, voices weaving chants that no one claimed to have composed. The refrain, half word, half sigh, translated roughly as, "We remember forward." No one called it a performance. It was continuation. Somewhere, deep beneath consciousness, they knew that the chief's canoe was still sailing, carrying not just one people's hope but the planet's long memory of respect. Artifacts of the original production had become relics by then. Museums displayed fragments of costumes encased in climate-proof glass, visitors bowed instinctively before them. Scholars traced the fibers, the pigments, the fingerprints of artisans long gone. But the greater treasure was invisible, the discipline of reverence that the work had taught. Every craftsman, every storyteller, every scientist tracing coral regrowth felt themselves in quiet dialogue with that same discipline. It was no longer about imitation, it was about continuation of care. And when future historians wrote of humanity's slow reconciliation with the earth, they often began with a familiar image, a canoe gliding into morning light, a chief gazing toward horizon, not in conquest but communion. They called it the turning point, the moment when cinema remembered its origin in ritual, when art remembered its duty to heal. In those chronicles, Chief of War was described not as series, not even as myth, but as gesture, the act of reaching back through centuries of forgetting to touch the pulse of belonging once more. Even when the human species spread far beyond its cradle, establishing homes on distant worlds, the story followed. Generations who had never felt salt air still kept the chant alive. They sang to alien seas, invoking the same gratitude their ancestors had offered to Pacific tides. And though no sound from Earth could reach those distant waters, something in the rhythm of waves, wherever waves existed, seemed to answer. Perhaps memory is older than planet, perhaps it rides light itself. The descendants never doubted. They believed the chief still steered their voyage across the stars. So the chant continued, soft and endless, carried by breath and circuit alike. It said that strength is listening, that leadership is love, that home is wherever the story is told with truth. And in that telling, century after century, the world kept finding its way back to itself. In the quiet centuries that followed, even the memory of who had first told the story faded, but the essence of Chief of War lived on like fire under ash. The descendants of distant generations no longer called it by its ancient title. They referred to it simply as the canoe song. No one knew it had begun as a series of moving images. To them it was a sacred narrative passed through voice and gesture, a remembrance of balance between human and world. What survived of language had become elemental, wind syllables, water tones, but the emotion remained pure. Each retelling began the same way, with silence, with the sound of breath meeting sea. When the oceans rose again, swallowing cities of glass and iron, survivors sought guidance in the old chants. They rebuilt villages of wood and woven fiber, guided by teachings that had once been fiction. They no longer separated story from instruction. The wisdom of Chief of War, that power must kneel before compassion, became blueprint for survival. They organized councils as circles rather than hierarchies. Decisions were made in rhythm with tide and moon. They called themselves the children of the wave, and in every settlement a carving of a canoe stood facing the horizon, reminding them that life itself was a voyage of stewardship. Even those who lived far inland, among mountains or deserts, claimed kinship with the story. They drew waves in dust, painted canoes on stone. They said the ocean lived within blood, that to walk on land was simply to paddle through slower water. And when they told their children the tale of the chief who had learned to listen, their eyes shone with recognition though none had ever seen the sea. Through them, the myth transcended geography, it became a way of being human. Scholars of the New World, wandering archivists who carried fragments of lost knowledge, eventually uncovered remnants of the original work in buried data vaults. Faint digital echoes of moving images flickered to life, a man in red cloak standing before endless horizon. The colors were fractured, the sound warped by time, but the feeling was unmistakable. They gathered around the ghostly projection, and though none spoke the old language, they felt its meaning reverberate through the air. Some knelt. Others wept. They realized that this was the source of the chants their ancestors had preserved through centuries of ruin. The fiction had become faith, and faith had become foundation. From those fragments they rebuilt a new form of storytelling, part hologram, part ritual, part communion. People would gather under open skies to witness the recreated scenes, blending them with live chant and dance. The experience was no longer called film, it was ceremony. To attend it was to renew covenant with earth. The line between spectator and participant dissolved, just as the original creators had intended centuries earlier. As ages passed, the universe expanded, and humanity scattered among worlds, but wherever they traveled, they carried the canoe emblem. On orbital stations, it was etched into hulls beside airlocks. On icy moons, colonists built domes shaped like sails. Every year, on the solstice, they synchronized their transmissions across light years to chant the old refrain in unison, "We remember forward." The sound waves, encoded into radio bursts, traveled into the cosmos, merging with starlight. Somewhere beyond measure, the echo of that chant still moves, carrying with it the last pure memory of a world that once learned to love its ocean. And perhaps, in some distant future unseen by any eye, another species will intercept that echo, decode the rhythm, and feel something stir, an intuition of balance, of reverence, of belonging. They will not know our names or faces, but they will sense the heartbeat of the sea and the wisdom of the chief who once listened. In that moment, the purpose of Chief of War will be fulfilled once again, not to tell humanity's story, but to teach any life that hears it how to live in harmony with its world. So the canoe sails onward through eternity, no longer bound to planet or time, guided by the song of tides that exist in every corner of creation. The chief still gazes toward horizon, his face illuminated by dawn that never ends, his voice a whisper carried by cosmic wind, remember who you are, and all shall be well. And with that whisper, the story continues, as stories always do, circling forever like the sea that birthed them.